The photograph was discovered in a safety deposit box at the First National Bank of Boston on November 3, 1952, 14 years after the men in it had died. It showed two young men standing on either side of an older man in a three-piece suit, all three unsmiling, positioned in front of a brick warehouse in the North End. The older man's hands rested on the shoulders of the younger two. On the back, in faded ink, Dante, Virgilio, and the Dawn. Summer 1936, before. The box had been rented under a false name. Inside, along with the photograph, investigators found a leather journal, a .38 revolver that had never been fired, and a single page torn from a Bible. The story of Cain and Abel, Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 16. Someone had underlined a single passage in red ink. Am I my brother's keeper? The journal contained no names, only initials. But the handwriting matched samples taken from Dante Luca Mancini's personal effects after his body was pulled from Boston Harbor in March 1938, his skull fractured in 3 places, his hands bound with rosary beads. This is not a story about a mob war. This is a story about what happens when a father tries to split an inheritance that cannot be divided. When brothers are taught that blood is both sacred and expendable, and when loyalty becomes the weapon that destroys the thing it was meant to protect. This is the story of how the Mancini family, one of the 5 ruling crime families in Boston during Prohibition and its aftermath, tore itself apart from the inside. Not because of betrayal by outsiders, but because a dying patriarch could not choose between his sons, and his sons could not imagine sharing what they believed was theirs by divine right. Before we continue, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city? Which state? I want to know who's listening to this story, because what happened in Boston in 1938 wasn't unique to that city or that time. It's a pattern that repeats wherever power is inherited, wherever sons are raised to believe they are owed something, simply because of whose blood runs in their veins. To understand how 2 brothers could destroy each other and the empire their father built, we must go back to a cold February morning in 1910, to a tenement apartment in the North End of Boston, where Salvatore Mancini, known to everyone simply as the Don, held his newborn twin sons for the first time. They were born during a blizzard. The midwife arrived late, her coat covered in snow, her hands shaking from cold. Salvatore's wife, Lucia, had been in labor for 19 hours. The first son came at dawn, screaming. The second came 20 minutes later, silent. The midwife thought he was dead until she held him upside down and slapped his back, and he released a single piercing cry that Lucia would later say sounded like a warning. They named the first son Dante, after the poet who had mapped the circles of hell. They named the second Virgilio, after the guide who had led Dante through them. Salvatore, who had arrived in Boston from Sicily at age 16 with nothing but a straight razor and a talent for violence, believed in symbols. He believed that names carried destiny. He told Lucia that night, as she held both babies against her chest, that these boys would lead the family into a new era, that they would be educated, refined, legitimate, that they would transform what he had built through blood into something that could last. He was half right. The boys grew up in parallel. They shared a bedroom, shared clothes, shared a language they invented as children that no one else could understand. Salvatore enrolled them in the same Catholic school, bought them matching suits, took them to the same barber. Photographs from their childhood show them always together, always dressed identically, their faces so similar that even family members sometimes confused them. But those who knew them well could see the differences. Dante smiled more easily. Virgilio watched more carefully. Dante spoke first. Virgilio spoke last. Dante led, Virgilio followed, until the day he didn't. Salvatore built his empire on three principles: family, silence, and fear. He ran bootlegging operations throughout New England during Prohibition, controlled the docks, owned the police, and never spent a single night in jail. He was careful, methodical, and ruthless when necessary. But he was also sentimental. He believed in blood above all else. He believed that family was the only thing a man could trust, the only thing worth dying for. He raised his sons in this belief. He taught them that the family was a sacred trust, that their duty was to protect it, to expand it, to pass it on to their own sons one day. What he didn't teach them was how to share it. By the time Dante and Virgilio turned 18, in 1928, Salvatore's operation had grown into a sprawling network of speakeasies, gambling dens, and labor rackets. He controlled the Teamsters, the longshoremen, the construction unions. He had judges on his payroll, senators in his pocket, and a network of enforcers who would kill on his word. He was 52 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and beginning to think about succession. He made his first mistake that summer. He called both sons into his office, a room above a bakery on Hanover Street, where he conducted business every morning from 6 to noon, and told them he was grooming them both to take over. He said the family was big enough for 2 leaders. He said they would rule together, as brothers, as equals. He said this was the modern way, the American way: division of labor, checks and balances, partnership. Dante and Virgilio nodded. They shook their father's hand. They embraced each other. And then they went to war. It started small. Dante began arriving at the office earlier than Virgilio, staying later, taking meetings his brother wasn't invited to. Virgilio started cultivating relationships with the family's capos, the men who ran the street-level operations, the soldiers who did the actual work of enforcement and collection. Dante focused on expansion, on new territories, on alliances with other families. Virgilio focused on consolidation, on tightening control over what they already had, on loyalty. Salvatore watched this happen and told himself it was healthy competition. He told himself his sons were learning, testing themselves, proving their worth. He told himself that when the time came, they would find a way to work together. He was a man who had survived gang wars, federal investigations, and assassination attempts, but he could not see what was happening in his own home. The journal found in the safety deposit box begins in January 1936. The first entry is dated January 7th. It reads, "Vi came to my apartment last night. We drank whiskey and talked about the old days when we used to sneak onto the docks and watch the ships come in. He asked me if I remembered the pact we made when we were 12, that we would never let anything come between us. I said I remembered. He asked me if I still believed it. I didn't answer. He left at midnight. I watched him walk down the street until I couldn't see him anymore. I think that was the last time we were really brothers. What happened between January and summer is documented in fragments, police reports, witness statements, rumors that circulated through the North End like smoke. In February, one of Dante's top lieutenants was found beaten nearly to death in an alley behind a social club controlled by Virgilio's crew. In March, a shipment of Canadian whiskey that Virgilio had arranged disappeared from a warehouse, and the 2 men guarding it claimed they'd been ordered to move it by someone who looked exactly like Virgilio but wasn't. In April, Dante opened a new gambling operation in Charlestown without consulting his brother. In May, Virgilio began holding private meetings with the family's bookkeeper, a man named Aldo Rossini who kept the ledgers, who knew where every dollar came from and where it went. Salvatore was dying. He had been diagnosed with stomach cancer in late 1935, and by the spring of 1936, he was gaunt, gray, moving slowly. He still came to the office every morning, but he left earlier, and he delegated more. He told his sons to handle things. He told them he trusted them. He told them the family was in good hands. The photograph on the back of which someone had written before was taken in June 1936 at a family gathering to celebrate Salvatore's 58th birthday. It was held at a restaurant in the North End that Salvatore owned, a place called Paradiso, where the family gathered for weddings, christenings, funerals. The photograph shows Salvatore in the center, his hands on his son's shoulders, his face expressionless. Dante is on his right, smiling slightly. Virgilio is on his left, looking directly at the camera. If you study the photograph closely, you can see that Salvatore's hand on Virgilio's shoulder is gripping tighter, the knuckles white. You can see that Dante's smile doesn't reach his eyes. You can see that Virgilio's jaw is clenched. 3 months later, Salvatore called both sons to his bedside. He was in the final stages of the cancer, bedridden, unable to eat, drifting in and out of consciousness. Lucia sat beside him, holding his hand. A priest had been called to administer last rites. Dante and Virgilio stood on opposite sides of the bed. Salvatore looked at each of them in turn. He tried to speak, but his voice was too weak. He gestured for paper and pen. Lucia brought them. He wrote something, folded the paper, and handed it to Dante. Then he wrote something else, folded it, and handed it to Virgilio. Then he closed his eyes and died. Neither brother opened his note in front of the other. They stood there, in that room that smelled of medicine and incense and death, and they looked at each other across their father's body. Then Dante turned and walked out. Virgilio stayed for another hour, sitting beside his mother, holding her as she wept. The funeral was held 3 days later, on September 12, 1936. It was the largest funeral the North End had ever seen. Over 2,000 people attended. The procession stretched for blocks. Salvatore was buried in a mausoleum at Mount Calvary Cemetery, a structure he had commissioned himself, built from white marble imported from Italy, with his name carved above the entrance in letters a foot high. Dante and Virgilio stood side by side during the service, both dressed in black, both silent. Witnesses would later say they never looked at each other once. After the funeral, the family gathered at Paradiso for a meal. This was tradition: food, wine, stories about the deceased, a celebration of life. But the meal was tense, quiet. Dante sat at one end of the long table. Virgilio sat at the other. The capos and soldiers sat between them, unsure where to look, who to talk to, how to navigate this new landscape. Halfway through the meal, Dante stood and raised his glass. He said his father had been a great man, a visionary, a leader who had built something from nothing. He said it was now their responsibility to honor his legacy, to protect what he had built, to carry it forward. He said he would dedicate his life to this mission. Then he sat down. Virgilio did not stand. He did not raise his glass. He simply looked at his brother and said, "We'll see." The notes Salvatore had written on his deathbed were never made public, but according to testimony given years later by Aldo Rossini, the bookkeeper, to a federal grand jury investigating the Mancini family, both notes said the same thing. "You are my son. You are my heir. The family is yours. Protect it. Lead it. Make me proud." Salvatore had given each son the same message. He had told each of them that they were the chosen one. He had, in his final act, made it impossible for them to share power, because each believed he had been anointed by their father as the sole legitimate successor. What followed was not a war in the traditional sense. There were no public shootouts, no bombings, no headlines. The Mancini family had always operated in silence, and the conflict between Dante and Virgilio was conducted in the same way. It was a war of ledgers and loyalties, of whispered conversations and strategic absences, of money redirected and soldiers reassigned. It was a war fought in the shadows, in back rooms, in the early hours of the morning when decisions were made that would only become visible weeks later. Dante controlled the expansion operations, the new territories, the alliances with families in New York and Philadelphia, the investments in legitimate businesses. Virgilio controlled the core operations, the docks, the unions, the street-level rackets that generated the daily cash flow. Dante had vision, Virgilio had infrastructure, Dante had ambition, Virgilio had loyalty, and both believed they had their father's blessing. The journal entries from this period are sparse, fragmented, written in a hand that becomes increasingly erratic. October 15, 1936, met with the capos today. Half of them won't look me in the eye. They're waiting to see who wins. Loyalty is just another word for fear. November 3rd, V is moving money. Rossini told me he's been transferring funds to accounts I don't have access to. When I confronted him, he said he was protecting the family's assets. From who? From me? December 20th, saw V at midnight mass. We sat on opposite sides of the church. I watched him take communion. I wondered if he was praying for forgiveness or for victory. The breaking point came in January 1937. Dante had negotiated a deal with a New York family to expand into their territory in exchange for a percentage of the profits. It was a lucrative arrangement, one that would have doubled the Mancini family's income within a year. But it required a significant upfront investment, cash that was currently sitting in the family's accounts that Virgilio controlled through Rossini. Dante called a meeting of the family's leadership, the capos, the senior soldiers, the men who had served under Salvatore for decades. He laid out the deal. He explained the opportunity. He asked for the money. Virgilio, who had not been told about the meeting until an hour before it started, stood up and said no. The room went silent. Dante asked why. Virgilio said the deal was reckless, that it exposed the family to risk, that it violated their father's principle of never overextending. Dante said their father had also believed in growth, in seizing opportunities, in building something larger than themselves. Virgilio said their father had believed in caution, in protecting what they had, in not trusting outsiders. The argument escalated. Voices were raised. At one point, Dante slammed his hand on the table and said, "He left the family to me." Virgilio stood, looked at his brother and said, "He left it to me." The meeting ended without a resolution. The capos filed out, silent, shaken. Dante and Virgilio remained in the room, alone, staring at each other across the table. According to one witness who lingered outside the door, Dante said, "This can't continue." Virgilio said, "I agree." Then Virgilio walked out. The next day, Aldo Rossini disappeared. His wife reported him missing on January 18, 1937. She said he had left for work that morning and never came home. His office above the bakery was empty. His ledgers were gone. The safe where he kept the family's cash reserves had been opened and emptied. Over $300,000, the equivalent of several million today, was missing. Dante immediately accused Virgilio of orchestrating the theft. Virgilio denied it. He said Rossini must have been skimming for years, that he had finally decided to run, that this was what happened when you trusted outsiders with family business. Dante, said Rossini had been loyal to Salvatore for 20 years, that he would never have stolen, that the only way he would have taken that money was if someone with authority had ordered him to. Virgilio said, "Are you accusing me of theft?" Dante said, "I'm accusing you of treason." The family fractured. Capos chose sides. Soldiers aligned themselves with one brother or the other. The North End, which had been unified under Salvatore's rule, became a patchwork of territories, each controlled by men loyal to either Dante or Virgilio. Meetings were held in secret. Shipments were rerouted. Payments were withheld. The infrastructure that Salvatore had spent 30 years building began to collapse. Aldo Rossini's body was found on February 9, 1937, in a shallow grave in the Middlesex Fells Reservation, a wooded area north of Boston. He had been shot once in the back of the head. His hands had been cut off. The ledgers were never recovered. The money was never found. The police investigation went nowhere. No witnesses came forward. No arrests were made. The case was filed as unsolved. But within the family, everyone knew what had happened. Rossini had been killed to send a message. The question was, which brother had sent it? Dante believed Virgilio had killed Rossini to cover up the theft, to eliminate the only man who could testify to where the money had gone. Virgilio believed Dante had killed Rossini to frame him, to turn the family against him, to justify what was coming next. Both were probably right. The journal entries from February and March 1937 are the darkest in the collection. February 14th, I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see V standing over me. I've started carrying a gun. I've started checking the locks on my doors 3 times before bed. This is what we've become. March 2nd. One of my men was killed last night, shot in his car outside his home. His wife found him. I went to the funeral. V was there. We didn't speak. I wanted to kill him right there, in front of everyone. I wanted to wrap my hands around his throat and watch the life leave his eyes. But I didn't. Because he's my brother. Because some part of me still believes we can find a way back. They couldn't. On March 15, 1938, Dante Mancini was found dead in Boston Harbor. His body was discovered by a fisherman at dawn, floating face down near the docks. His hands bound behind his back with rosary beads, his skull fractured in 3 places. The medical examiner determined he had been beaten to death, then thrown into the water while still alive. He had drowned. The rosary beads were identified as belonging to a set that had been blessed by the Archbishop of Boston and given to Salvatore Mancini as a gift in 1925. Salvatore had kept them in a glass case in his office. After his death, they had disappeared. The murder was never solved. No arrests were made. The police file contains witness statements from over 40 people, none of whom saw anything, heard anything, or knew anything. The investigation was closed after 6 months. Virgilio Mancini attended his brother's funeral. He stood beside his mother, who had not spoken since Dante's body was found, who would not speak again for the remaining 3 years of her life. He wore a black suit. He did not cry. After the service, as the casket was being lowered into the ground, into the same mausoleum where Salvatore was buried, Virgilio placed a single white rose on top of it. Then he walked away. 3 days after the funeral, Virgilio called a meeting of the entire family. He stood in the same room where he and Dante had argued a year earlier. He looked at the assembled capos and soldiers, men who had served his father, men who had watched 2 brothers destroy each other and everything their father had built. He said, "This ends now. The war is over. I am the head of this family. Anyone who has a problem with that can leave. But if you stay, you follow my orders. You give me your loyalty, and you never speak my brother's name again. No one left. No one spoke. Virgilio had won, but he had won nothing. The Mancini family never recovered. The money Rossini had taken, or that had been taken in his name, was never recovered. The alliances Dante had built collapsed. The territories Virgilio had controlled were absorbed by rival families. By 1940, the Mancinis were a shadow of what they had been under Salvatore. By 1945, they were gone entirely, absorbed into other organizations, their name erased from the landscape of Boston organized crime. Virgilio himself disappeared in 1942. He was last seen boarding a train to New York. Some said he had been killed by rivals seeking revenge for old debts. Some said he had fled to Italy, to Sicily, to the village where his father had been born. Some said he had simply walked away, that he had taken what money remained and vanished into anonymity, that he was living under a new name in a new city, trying to forget what he had done. The journal found in the safety deposit box ends with an entry dated March 10, 1938, 5 days before Dante's death. It reads, "I had a dream last night. V and I were children again, back in the apartment where we grew up. We were lying in our beds, talking in the dark, the way we used to. I asked him if he remembered the pact we made, that we would never let anything come between us. He said he remembered. I asked him if he thought we had kept it. He didn't answer. When I woke up, I realized I couldn't remember the sound of his voice. I can see his face. I can see him standing in front of me. But I can't hear him anymore. I think that's how you know it's over. When the person you loved most in the world becomes a stranger. The photograph, the journal, the gun, and the Bible page remained in the safety deposit box for 14 years. The box had been rented under the name Kane, paid for in advance through 1955. When the bank finally opened it, after the rental period expired and no one came to claim it, they found a note tucked inside the journal. It was written in the same hand as the journal entries, but the ink was different, fresher. It was dated March the 14th, 1938, the day before Dante's body was found. It read, "If you're reading this, I'm dead. I know who killed me. I know why. I forgive him. Because he's my brother. Because I would have done the same thing. Because this is what our father made us. Tell V I'm sorry. Tell him I loved him. Tell him I hope he finds peace. I never will." The note was signed with a single initial. D. Federal investigators who examined the evidence in 1952 as part of a broader investigation into organized crime in Boston concluded that Dante Mancini had rented the safety deposit box himself, that he had placed the items inside knowing he was going to die, that he had created a time capsule of his own murder. They theorized that he had confronted Virgilio, that he had given his brother a choice, walk away or kill me, and that Virgilio had made his choice. They theorized that Dante had gone to his death willingly, that he had allowed himself to be killed because he could not kill his brother, because he believed that his death might end the war, might save what remained of the family. They were wrong. Dante's death didn't end anything. It simply made the destruction complete. The question that haunted investigators, that haunts anyone who studies this case, is simple. What did Salvatore's notes actually say? Did he really tell both sons they were his heir? Or did one of them lie? Did Dante fabricate his father's blessing to justify his claim? Did Virgilio? Or did Salvatore, in his final moments, in his pain and confusion and grief, actually write two identical notes? Actually tell both sons they were chosen, actually set in motion the very conflict he had spent his life trying to prevent? We'll never know. The notes were never found. Virgilio took his to the grave, wherever that grave is. Dante's note, if it ever existed, disappeared along with everything else. But here's what we do know. Salvatore Mancini built an empire on the principle that family was sacred, that blood was the only thing you could trust. He raised his sons to believe this. He taught them that loyalty to family was the highest virtue, that betrayal of family was the gravest sin. And then, in his final act, whether through intention or accident, he forced his sons to choose between their loyalty to each other and their loyalty to the family itself. He made it impossible for them to have both. Dante and Virgilio were not criminals who happened to be brothers. They were brothers who were taught that love and loyalty and duty were the same thing, and when those things came into conflict, when they were forced to choose between the brother they loved and the inheritance they believed they were owed, they chose the inheritance. They chose power over blood. They chose the family over each other. And in doing so, they destroyed both. The human capacity for self-deception is nearly infinite. We tell ourselves stories about who we are, about what we're fighting for, about what we're willing to sacrifice. Dante told himself he was protecting his father's legacy. Virgilio told himself he was preserving the family's future. Both believed they were acting out of love, out of duty, out of honor. Both believed the other had betrayed everything their father stood for, and both were probably right. Because here's the thing about inherited power, about empires built on blood. They require a clarity of succession that families almost never have. They require someone to make a choice, to name an heir, to create a hierarchy that everyone accepts. Salvatore couldn't do it. He loved both his sons equally. He saw himself in both of them. He wanted both of them to succeed him. So he told them both they could. And in trying to give them everything, he gave them nothing but a reason to destroy each other. The Mancini family is gone, is now. The empire Salvatore built has been absorbed, forgotten, erased. The North End has changed. The docks are quiet. The warehouses have been converted into condos. Paradiso, the restaurant where the family gathered, closed in 1965 and is now a coffee shop. The mausoleum at Mount Calvary Cemetery still stands, but the name above the entrance has weathered, the letters fading. Salvatore is buried there. Dante is buried there. Lucia is buried there. Virgilio is buried somewhere else, or nowhere, or everywhere. But the photograph remains, and the journal, and the question. If you were Dante, standing in that room with your brother, knowing that one of you had to yield and neither of you could, what would you have done? If you were Virgilio, watching your brother claim what you believed was yours by right, by blood, by your father's own words, how far would you have gone to take it back? And if you were Salvatore, lying on your deathbed, looking at your two sons, knowing you had to choose but unable to, what would you have written? Maybe the truth is that there was no good choice. Maybe the tragedy of the Mancini family wasn't that Salvatore chose wrong, but that he was given a choice that had no right answer. Maybe the real question isn't who killed Dante Mancini, or why, or whether Virgilio was justified, or whether Salvatore intended to divide his sons. Maybe the real question is this: can you build something on blood and loyalty and expect it to survive when those two things come into conflict? Can you raise sons to believe that family is everything and then ask them to share the throne? Can you create an empire based on the principle that there can be only one leader and then tell two people they're both chosen? The answer, written in the bodies buried in Mount Calvary Cemetery, written in the ledgers that were never recovered, written in the silence that fell over the North End after March 1938, is no. You can't. The system contains its own destruction. The inheritance carries its own curse. The blessing is also the wound. Dante Mancini wrote in his final journal entry that he couldn't remember the sound of his brother's voice. That's what happens when love becomes a battlefield, when loyalty becomes a weapon, when family becomes the thing you're willing to kill for. The person you knew, the person you grew up with, the person you shared a language with that no one else could understand. They become a stranger. They become the enemy. They become the thing standing between you and what you believe you deserve. And in the end, you destroy them. Or they destroy you. Or you destroy each other, and the thing you were fighting over crumbles to dust, and no one wins, and no one survives. And the only thing left is a photograph of 3 men standing together before, when they still believed that blood was enough, that family was sacred, that love could survive anything. It couldn't. The truth, like so much about the Mancini family, remains buried in sealed files, in unmarked graves, in safety deposit boxes rented under false names, in the silence of men who knew what happened but would never speak, in the memories of a neighborhood that has forgotten or chosen to forget what once happened in its streets. But the question remains. It always remains. Because the Mancini family's story isn't just about Boston in 1938. It's about every family that builds an empire and can't figure out how to pass it on. It's about every father who loves his children equally and can't choose between them. It's about every pair of brothers who are taught that they're special, that they're chosen, that they're destined for greatness, and then forced to fight each other for the right to claim it. How do you divide an inheritance that can't be divided? How do you share power that only works when it's absolute? How do you love someone and compete with them for the same throne? And when the choice comes, and it always comes, between the person you love and the thing you believe you're owed, which do you choose? Dante chose the family. Virgilio chose the family, and the family died with both of them. Maybe some thrones aren't meant to be inherited. Maybe some empires aren't meant to last. Maybe some families aren't meant to survive the transition from one generation to the next. Maybe the real legacy Salvatore Mancini left his sons wasn't an empire at all. Maybe it was a test they both failed, a test no one could have passed. Am I my brother's keeper? The Bible page in the safety deposit box asked the question. Neither brother answered it. Or maybe they did. Maybe the answer is written in the rosary beads wrapped around Dante's wrists as he drowned. Maybe it's written in the white rose Virgilio placed on his brother's casket. Maybe it's written in the silence that followed, in the empire that crumbled, in the family that disappeared. Maybe the answer is yes, you are. And when you forget that, when you choose power over blood, when you let inheritance become more important than love, you lose everything. Not just the throne, not just the empire, but the only thing that ever really mattered. The brother who knew you before you became what you became. The person who shared your language, your history, your blood. The keeper you were supposed to be, and in losing that, you lose yourself.